Hello, everybody. My name is Jean Tiberio, and you're listening to Healing Outside the Box. Today we have episode 217, and I'm calling it Preventing Diabetic Complications, Part 2, Diet and Lifestyle Factors to Consider that will Prevent Complications. Now, I apologize ahead of time for the water running in the background, but it's been raining for 40 days and 40 nights, and there's no getting around it. Now, last week in Part 1, I went over the symptoms of uncontrolled diabetes and the possible complications that you might face if the diabetes stays uncontrolled. I recommend that you give that a listen if you haven't, and then you can come back to this. You don't necessarily have to. You may know your goals and your numbers and all that sort of thing. But it's episode 216 if you want to have a look. Now, here we go. There are many versions of the diet that dietary professionals recommend for diabetes, but in general, we like to recommend a high-fiber, plant-strong diet that is also low in saturated fat and sodium. My personal opinion is that a high-fiber version of the Mediterranean diet with exercise, stress reduction, and a lower alcohol intake is the way to go. But the Diabetes Association has a similar version that works. They just don't call it Mediterranean. They call it Diabetes Association. Because everybody wants to promote themselves, and why not? Now, I'm not recommending the ketogenic diet for the following reasons. In theory, this diet includes plenty of greens and other low-calorie vegetables, but in reality, most people on a keto diet will eat a decent amount of saturated fat and cholesterol. Scientists showed a while ago, actually, that if you eat a big prime rib meal, that one meal will cause a high enough spike in LDL to actually do a little damage to the lining of your arteries. It actually turns your blood a little bit of a different color, because obviously fat is white. In addition, when you eat a high animal protein diet, there's an inflammatory, oxidative, and can be a plaque accumulation situation going on. There's several factors to consider, is what I'm trying to say. The produce foods are anti-inflammatory and antioxidative, but if you're not eating a lot of plant foods, it can't completely neutralize what the meat is doing. Now, we can't use a double-blind study to prove that a high-protein, high-fat, low-carb diet will do this, but common sense leads us in that direction. Now, if you're on a keto diet, your A1C will go down and your weight will go down. But long-term, it may be at the expense of your heart and your other arteries. The other thing is, can you really keep up a very low-carb diet indefinitely? No bread, no fruit? Where would those antioxidants come from? Okay, so let's get back to the health goals for preventing uncontrolled diabetes. After we go over the general health goals, I'll get into the dietary details. Number 1 is weight loss. Weight loss will drop your sugars immediately because the dietary changes necessary to lose that weight will result in less glucose in your bloodstream. It actually doesn't take a lot of weight loss to normalize those blood sugars. For example, if you've got 80 to 100 pounds to lose to get to your chart weight, losing only 20 pounds should normalize your sugars. But you should be definitely following your doctor's advice as to how much weight to lose and over what time. And you can also see a nutritionist, and many of us do phone sessions now. In other words, you can check in with your nutritionist or wellness coach weekly or bi-weekly to talk about your progress and ask for advice. Because let's face it, we all know that weight loss can be challenging, so I recommend getting support in any way that works for you. Now, the second thing is sodium intake. Weight loss combined with a lower sodium intake will help you drop your blood pressure to normal levels. And part of this will happen naturally. In other words, less Doritos equals less salt. And your weight loss in the first couple of weeks will include some water that has been accumulating in the ankles, in the belly, etc. Now, I don't know if you're interested in this, but there's a thing called metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome is a thing if you have 3 or more of the following: a waist circumference over 35 inches for women and over 40 inches for men. So you can just put a tape measure around your stomach at the belly button and see what it says if you dare. Now, blood pressure over 130 for systolic, over 85 for diastolic. Another risk factor is fasting triglyceride over 150. And then this fasting HDL under 40 for men and under 50 for women. And a fasting blood sugar over 100. If you have 3 of those things, you have metabolic syndrome. And it might be one of your goals to not have that. Makes sense? Okay, number 3. We generally recommend 3 meals per day and a light nighttime snack. Keeping the meals about the same time and controlling the portions at any one meal will really help, because we want your sugars to be a small baby roller coaster, not a steep, spiky roller coaster. We also recommend taking oral meds at the same time every day. If you're on insulin, obviously talk to your doctor about the strength and frequency of your insulin. A lot of people are now getting sliding scale pens to deliver the insulin, and that's a good thing. It's a better thing to get off the insulin, but please talk to your doctor about that. Number 4 for your goals is to keep those inflammatory or processed foods to a minimum. And that's not only to lower your risk of diabetic complications, it's also to lower your risk of cancer. And of course, your goal would be to increase your antioxidants like vitamin C and eat lots of fiber in general. Number 5 is smoking cessation. That's self-explanatory. I have multiple episodes on antioxidants in food, and I'll give you the links in the show notes. Number 6 is stress reduction. Also self-explanatory. I have episodes on the benefits of meditation, and I'll give you those links as well. Number 7 is exercise. Experts often recommend a combination of aerobic and strength training, at least 2 or 3 times a week. They also say it's good to find something that you can do indoors. If it in fact is raining for 40 days and 40 nights in your neck of the woods. When I'm giving advice about this in a nutrition counseling session, I may mention that it sometimes helps to insert it into your daily routine, as you would, say, brushing your teeth or feeding your pets. Okay, now let's talk about the dietary details. First of all, we want fiber, fiber, and more fiber. And I say that not just to be irritating, although I imagine it has that effect. I say it because the fiber slows down the absorption of the breakdown products of carbohydrates, i.e. glucose. That's true whether it's a simple sugar like fructose from fruit or a larger starch like wheat. The general recommendation is 25 to 35 grams per day. If it sounds like a lot, you would be correct, but that's the recommendation. We often like to mention the Fabulous 5, a combination of 5 servings of fruits and vegetables every day. The Mediterranean diet is not exclusively a plant diet, but it has been shown to be actually high in fiber, and the epidemiological data shows it to be very effective lowering the incidence of diabetes. Now you could go on a vegetarian diet, in other words, an abundance of greens, legumes, and no meat. That may or may not be feasible if you have a family to feed and you want this to be a lifelong adventure. It turns out you could get similar benefits in terms of reduced weight, normalized blood sugars, and lower blood pressure either way. If you go vegetarian, your cholesterol will be much lower, and you may essentially eliminate your chances of having a heart attack, but today we're talking about diabetes. So whole grains and produce have been associated with preventing diabetes as well as controlling diabetes once you have it. It comes as no surprise that refined grains and low fiber have the opposite effect. You will likely need increasing amounts of metformin and then insulin. The controversy as far as the Mediterranean diet goes is regarding the alcohol. A decent amount of alcohol is tied to higher breast cancer risk. The thing is, it's hard to get an accurate intake data about alcohol use. People generally like to round down when it comes to being asked how much they've had to drink. And if you're worried about that phytonutrient effect, it's better to actually eat the grapes than drink the red wine. I don't mean to be a buzzkill, but alcohol also provides a decent amount of calories, which will interfere with your weight loss goals. There's about 80 calories to a jigger of vodka. But again, I'm only the messenger here. Having a glass of wine with dinner is not going to do much of anything, so don't worry about that. Now, sodium intake. We Americans take in 7,000 to 10,000 milligrams of sodium, and that's very important to reduce the risk of that metabolic syndrome that I was talking about. Just to give you an idea, a reduced sodium diet that doctors prescribe is generally geared toward 4,000 milligrams. So what we're trying to say here is that the sodium in just about everything, unless you eat whole foods as close to its natural state as possible. Okay, so healthy diets to control diabetes, whether it be Mediterranean or Diabetic Association or Zone Diet, have 4 things in common. Okay, number 1, they encourage more fruits. And this is primarily fruits that have skins. But all fruits are good. Most professionals recommend some berries because they're high in antioxidants. But again, any fruits, apples with skins, pears, peaches, grapefruits, melons, it's all good. Number 2, vegetables. Again, unprocessed is better. In terms of nutrients, the frozen vegetables aren't all that different than the fresh vegetables, but the flavor is better if it's local and fresh. We all know that. But frozen still is a good option, especially with kids. The third item is whole grains. They're now coming out with other whole grain things. They even have whole grain goldfish crackers, whole grain flatbreads. There's a lot of whole grains that you can incorporate, and they taste pretty good. Not like the 100% whole wheat from the 70s that we used to call a doorstop. The 21st century processing techniques are much better to make these whole grains tasty. Now, number 4, for the protein groups, obviously more nuts and beans. In other words, plant sources of protein. Always a good idea because they provide fiber and have 0 cholesterol, obviously. Cholesterol only comes from animals. And a lot less saturated fat. Essentially none in some of these. In terms of actual animal products, fish is better than chicken and turkey, which is better than red meat. The only exception with the fish is the caution about mercury in the larger fishes. So they're saying it's okay, but don't eat it every night, which most people don't. When it comes to buying your oils, get organic if possible. In this country, soybean oil is almost always genetically modified and thus contains a bit of Roundup. You may have heard that organizations have gone in and tested all these oils and other foods for Roundup, and most products now contain the actual herbicide in the product. That goes for canola oil as well as the soybean. If you get the organic oils, you should be fine. I know it's a little more expensive, but I think this is one of the products that's important to get organic. The World Health Organization has now classified glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, to be a known carcinogen. Now, Dr. Michael Greger on his website talks about a study in which they gave different populations of people points and compared groups in terms of risk factors for diabetes as well as heart disease. So they scored people more for whole foods and subtracted points for things like potato chips. So you've got the highest scoring people being the vegans. They have the highest score and live longer with less disease. But they also looked at people that scored, instead of 100%, maybe 80%. So their score was okay, or it was good. The question is, would that eliminate diabetes? And it appears to be from this study that the answer is yes. In other words, you don't have to eat perfectly to eliminate your risk of diabetic complications. Now, I've talked about the Mediterranean diet. So I'll talk a little about the American Dietetic Association diet and talk about their principles. Now, I'm getting this information from the Mayo Clinic description of the ADA, and I'll put a link in the show notes. Here's what they do. They call this the plate method. So they're offering up this simple method of meal planning in terms of your plate. It focuses again on more vegetables in smaller portions on things containing fat and cholesterol. So here's what they say. Fill half of your plate with non-starchy vegetables, like spinach, carrots, tomatoes, etc. Fill a quarter of your plate with a protein, fish, lean pork, or chicken. Fill the last quarter of your plate with a whole grain, such as a starchy vegetable, sweet potatoes, or peas, or brown rice, or a pasta. Include good fats, like nuts, or maybe avocados. Add 3 servings of fruits per day. If you have dairy, use the low-fat dairy, and drink plenty of water. Now, if you're insulin dependent, your dietitian may teach you how to do something called counting carbohydrates. This is for stricter control, and it will help control the blood sugars over that span of time that you eat and your food gets absorbed. So you're learning to calculate the amount of carbohydrates that are getting absorbed into your bloodstream. It's all about food portions and when you eat, so you can calculate about how many grams of carbohydrate you're taking in. We used to call this food exchanges, but now they call it a choice. So like 1 serving of carbohydrate is called a choice, and it will contain roughly 15 grams of carbohydrate. And I guess the one piece of advice I'll leave you with is to have a plan. Have a plan for the types of food that you wish to eat, a plan about how to distribute that food, how to eat with your family if your family wishes to eat separately, how to shop in the grocery store, and how to time when to do the cooking. And if that all sounds like a lot of planning, well, there is plenty of help out there. There are dietitians, there are nutritionists, and nutritionists/wellness coaches such as myself. You don't have to do this alone. There's also groups out there. There's diabetes groups, usually run by hospitals. There's Weight Watchers. There's diabetic meetup groups. There are podcasts devoted to living with diabetes. There's all kinds of things. If you have any questions for me, feel free to contact me on my website page, healingoutsidethebox.com, and I have a contact tab. But I encourage you to contact me with questions. It's certainly a lot to deal with, especially in the beginning. But again, you're not alone. That's all I have for you today. Be well and stay tuned next week for another episode of Healing Outside the Box.